Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. In today's video we have my Game Week 14 preview and we're going to discuss some of your key questions and dilemmas ahead of the Game Week 14 deadline. If you are enjoying the content here on this channel and you get any value from today's video, please smash that like button, make sure to subscribe as well. But without further ado, let's jump into it. So we're jumping into one of the key discussions around Game Week 14, which is Gordon versus Palmer. There's sort of two boats of people at the moment. One boat who are saying, I need a cheap midfielder. I probably think Gordon and Palmer are two of the better options. Who should I be going for? And then there are some people that own Anthony Gordon, and the plan around Game Week 14 was always to move towards Cole Palmer. But with Gordon's recent performances, they're now thinking, hang on a second, do I sell him? So I thought I would discuss them in their entirety. And I want to start by saying they are both great options. And I will critique them slightly here, just to give you a slightly different opinion. But that doesn't mean that I think they're bad options. And you do need to take into account price. They are both less than 6 million. So before I get into critiquing the two of them, I do want to just say they are good value assets. And when we're talking about price, at the time of me recording, there is a £0.6 million difference between the two. And you do need to take that into account. Even if right now you've got like 6.2 in the bank, and you're like, money's not an issue because I can afford both. At some point in the season, money always becomes an issue and you always wish you could have more. So immediately, Cole Palmer being cheaper is an advantage. I actually think the fixtures are identical. Before I started recording this, I was thinking, is there one where I think the fixtures are better? And I don't think so, because like this week I prefer Palmer's fixtures. Next week I probably slightly prefer the Newcastle one. Then in Game Week 16, I think it's fairly equal there. Game Week 17, slightly in favour probably of Cole Palmer. Game Week 18, slightly in favour of Gordon. So each week I think it is very, very close. Something which is maybe going against Gordon slightly is that he is exceptional at home and pretty poor away from home. So he's blanked in every away game this season, apart from the Sheffield United game in which Newcastle won 8-0. So you would expect him to return in that game. And he's returned in every home game this season. So at home, Gordon is a beast, and so are Newcastle. But away from home, he struggles a bit. And actually, 3 of the next 4 fixtures for Newcastle are away. But you would say, with the amount, well, obviously with the Van de Ven injury that they have, and few other injuries for Spurs, that's not a terrible fixture. We've just seen that Everton lost 3-0 to Manchester United at home, so that's not an awful fixture in 15. And in 18, whilst Luton aren't bad at home, it's certainly not a difficult fixture. So maybe we'll continue to see this trend where Gordon is much better at home and not as good away. But I think for now, I still think they are pretty decent fixtures. So fixtures-wise, pretty equal. Price obviously in favour of Cole Palmer. When we take a look at the underlying data, this is where I'm going to start to critique them. I was a bit disappointed for both of them. I've not really looked at the data for Palmer and Gordon recently, but neither of them have particularly good data. I mean, if we just jump straight into the non-penalty expected goal involvement, 0.45 for Gordon, 0.44 for Palmer. Now, when you take into account price, this is pretty decent data. But people are talking about both Gordon and Palmer as if they're essential. This data suggests that if they play 2 games, every 2 games they'll accumulate 1 expected goal involvement. So across like 12 games, you would expect them, based on the data, to get roughly 6 attacking returns. And actually, you think, but hang on a second, Gordon's been returning for fun. And this is what I'm going to now come on to. Gordon has been massively overperforming his data. So what that essentially means is it could be a couple of things. It could just be that he's in a really hot run of form. We saw this with Almiron last season. His data was okay, but he was just scoring for fun. And he actually managed to maintain that for quite a long period. So maybe Gordon is just feeling confident. He's finishing well. And he also plays amongst players such as Isak and Wilson. So if he creates chances for his teammates, there's a good chance they finish them because they are great finishers. So maybe Gordon will continue to overperform his data. The other option is that maybe he's just got lucky with a few finishes and maybe some of the keepers that he's played against have made mistakes too. I think it's probably a combination of all of those things, but you can see here, he's getting 6.38 FPL points per 90, but he's only been expected to get 4.2. So the data's not that amazing for Gordon. So all I would say on him is if you expect him to continue finishing pretty much all of the chances he gets and you expect him to continue to overperform his data, he is a great option at less than 6 million. But I would be a little bit concerned that normally what we see when someone is overperforming by this much is that they start to regress down a little bit and you'll start to see a little bit of a slowdown in his returns. But maybe that won't be for another 5 or 6 weeks and you can still jump on him. The only final thing I wanted to say about Gordon, which is a slight negative, is he's one of the only sort of midfielders in and around this price, which we'll actually discuss later in the video, who isn't on penalties. And yes, he hasn't needed penalties thus far, but if you've got other players at similar prices with similar data, it often makes sense to just back the penalty taker. And moving on to a penalty taker, we of course do have Palmer, who I still think probably will keep penalties when Nkunku comes back, but we don't really know that at the moment. So maybe a slight concern he loses them. The data, I would say, is slightly worse than Gordon's actually, because it's roughly the same non-penalty expected goal involvement, but you can see he's got more assist threat and less goal threat. Now, this has improved slightly in recent weeks, but not much. And I think what has happened with Palmer is he's very cheap. He's on penalties, the fixtures are good, and he's passing the eye test. But the reason that everyone wants him, and you can disagree with this all you want, is because he scored 4 penalties. And even if we know he scored 4 penalties, and we know that the only reason he's getting all these points is because of penalties, it still does skew our thinking, because 0.44 non-penalty expected goal involvement is okay. 0.2 non-penalty expected goals is not particularly good. And even though he is 5.3 million, this is now making me think, do I desperately want him that much? I think the only thing that still puts me massively in favour of him is the price, right? Price, penalties, and fixtures. He doesn't need to have the best data in the world, especially if you're trying to squeeze in Son, Salah, and Haaland into a single team alongside some of the other key players. But I think overall, these are 2 good value assets with good but not mind-blowing data, with good fixtures, and they are performing well. But I think Gordon has been massively overperforming recently. And I think Palmer is only in our thinking so much because he's scored 4 goals, but all 4 of those are penalties. So I would have no issues at all in the world going for either Gordon or Palmer this week. I think they're great options. I just think you need to temper your expectations. And we're going to move on to some other players a bit later in the video that are also on penalties with similar data. But the likes of Gibbs White, Hwang, other players in and around that price, even to some extent someone like a Willian, they are also putting up average-ish data like this. They are also on penalties, and some of them also have decent fixtures. So I don't think Gordon and Palmer are essential. I think if you don't own either of them, you don't desperately need to rush to bring them in. I think Mbeumo is much more of a priority. The final question was around, if you own Gordon, do you keep him or do you move to Palmer? This would suggest to me that Gordon and Palmer are pretty much equal options. The benefit for Palmer is he's cheaper and he's on penalties, but Gordon's got slightly greater goal threat, and I think the fixtures are fairly equal. So altogether, I like both Gordon. I like both Gordon and Palmer. They're not terrible options. I just don't think they're fantastic. If I was to choose one from scratch, it's Palmer, just due to the price and the penalties. But I think I do like the added goal threat of Gordon. So penalty taking seems to be bossing the conversation at the moment in FPL, and rightly so, because penalties are pretty common anyway in the Premier League, but specifically with VAR and this season, there just seem to be 3, 4, 5, 6 penalties per game week. So there's some questions going around, like, do we just genuinely only pick penalty takers? Are there enough good assets in FPL now that it just doesn't make sense to pick a player unless they're on penalties? And is it that much of an advantage? I mean, Arsenal have 6 penalties so far this season. They are the most in the league, but some other teams have like 5 for the likes of Newcastle and Liverpool. So I think it's definitely a conversation worth having. I will, start by saying no. I don't think you only pick penalty takers, obviously in the attack we're talking about, because there are some great assets such as Ollie Watkins, maybe a Darwin, Alvarez to some extent at points. So I don't think you only pick penalty takers. I think there will be great assets. Gordon is a good example, but what this makes me think is, maybe if you've got a 50-50 or you're choosing between 3 or 4, like, why would you not favour the penalty? If it genuinely is like a 3-way split and you can't really split the 3 players, or maybe it's something like Palmer versus Gordon where there's not a lot to split them, why not just back the penalty taker? Because yes, you might go through an 8-game week period where that player doesn't get a penalty, but why not at least increase your chances of getting points? So what I've done here is, I think, and I'm sure got this wrong, so please correct me down below if I have. I've tried my best here to list the 20 penalty takers in the Premier League. Some of them I'm a little bit less sure. Some of them it doesn't really matter. And I've tried grouping them into like gold tier, silver tier, and bronze tier, not with respect to how good they are at penalties, but how good they are as FPL assets, as well as being on penalties, right? So I think Haaland, Salah, Mbeumo, Saka, Son, and then whoever is taking penalties, I think Wilson is first choice. I think Isak would be second choice. But whoever's taking penalties for Newcastle, the amount of good chances they get anyway due to how attacking they are, I think I would still put them in that gold tier. So if you could get all of those in your team, I think it's worth doing. And to be honest, most people sitting here watching this will have Haaland, Salah, Mbeumo, Saka, and Son going into Game Week 14. So immediately there, you've got 5 penalty takers. And more importantly, immediately, you've got Salah, Mbeumo, Saka, and Son, which is 4 of your midfielders. So you've only got a fifth spot then. Some people will have either Saka or Son. So maybe you've got two more spots. But for most people, it's one or two spots left in that midfield. You've already got Haaland in there, most people. So you've got one or two spots in the midfield and then one forward. So does it make sense to then fill the rest of those spots with more penalty takers? Potentially, because again, you're just increasing your chance of getting points. So when we move down to, in my opinion, what the second tier is, I think you do have quite a few decent shouts at that more cheaper price point. So we know about Palmer. As long as he keeps pens, I think he's an absolutely brilliant option at 5.3. Fernandes is good, but he is quite expensive, which is why he's in tier 2. But if we're just looking at outright data and how good he is at pens, I would put him in tier 1. I know he gave a penalty to Rashford recently, but that was a one-off. He is still the first choice penalty taker. I think Eze, Gibbs-White, and Hwang, and I've put Hwang question mark because he did win the penalty, and we've not seen him take tons in the past. But if Hwang's on penalties, absolutely brilliant option. Eze obviously is just brilliant when he's fit. He's not fit at the moment, but when he's fit, he's even approaching tier 1. And Gibbs-White is putting up decent data, similar to what we've seen from Gordon and Palmer on pens, and the fixtures for Forest aren't bad either. So I would put all three of them in for a shout of filling out your 4th and 5th midfield spots. And then Solanke is a player that, whilst Bournemouth just don't get any penalties, if they do, he'll take them, and he is a really, really good penalty taker. So all of those players could fill you out. And then you've got more like João Pedro, Willian, Morris, Calvert-Lewin, Douglas Luiz, Ben Rama. But, I mean, you're unlikely to probably want these players in your team. But yes, I would be very surprised if even naturally you don't have 4, 5, 6 penalty takers in your team. Should you go for 7 or 8? Why not? Again, not just because they're on penalties. I would never say go out and just pick Morris and Calvert-Lewin because they're on pens. But when we're talking about players like Palmer, Eze, Gibbs-White, Hwang, they are such good assets anyway. You chuck penalties in there as well. Why not try and get 7 in your team? So I'm probably looking at building towards something similar, but it wouldn't be enough for me to sell a Darwin or a Watkins just because they're not on penalties. It may just influence if I've got a 50-50 decision, I lean towards the penalty taker. What I would like you to do is go into your team, look at how it's going to look for Game Week 14, and tell me, heading into 14, how many penalty takers will you have in your team? So we briefly spoke about Heung-min Son in the previous section, and I think it's worth discussing him because a lot of people need to get, or don't need to get to Mbeumo in Game Week 14, but feel like they need to in 14. And to be honest, I don't think any player in FPL is essential. I tried showing that with my Haaland experiment, but people have been without Haaland the whole season, or been without Salah the whole season, and performed very well. So no player is essential in FPL, but at his price, with the data that he's showing and the fixtures that he's got coming up, Mbeumo feels as close to essential as a player is going to get. So, of course, Heung-min Son, for so much more expensive, if you like the rest of your midfield, maybe you've got a Palmer and a Saka in there and a Salah, maybe you are thinking the only way for me to get Mbeumo is to sell Heung-min Son. It's not an easy yes or no, but I don't mind it either way, to be honest. I will give you my opinion, and I'll be honest, I am a massive Heung-min Son fan, not only in FPL, but in real life, and maybe I am slightly biased towards keeping him for that reason, but I'll try and go through the pros and the cons. Fixtures-wise, they aren't great. Man City away, Man City are still a great defence. I know they give this impression that they give up tons of chances, and in recent games they have. They conceded 4 to Chelsea, so they're not a perfect defence, but they are still in the top 3 defences in the league this season, and I don't think this is ever an easy game. So will Son get chances against City? Maybe. It's not a great fixture, though. West Ham at home is an excellent fixture. Newcastle at home is better than if it was away, but still not great. Forest away isn't a fantastic fixture. Everton at home is, and I don't mind Brighton away, but again, that would be a better fixture at home. So these aren't awful fixtures, but if you consider they play City and Newcastle in the next 3, followed by Forest away, which again isn't easy, these don't look like brilliant fixtures. However, City away is a Son fixture. Newcastle at home is a bit of a Son fixture too. So it's not necessarily, I don't think Son's fixture proof per se, but if you expect Spurs to still score goals in these games, which you probably do, Son is probably going to be the one that gets most of them, or at least some of them. So I don't think you need Spurs to go out and score 4 goals against the opposition for Son to get you FPL points. I think if City beat Spurs 4-1, you would think that that one is probably Son. And if Son comes away with 7 or 8 points, then it's still fine. So I think sometimes we confuse FPL and football. We don't need Spurs to be free-flowing and fantastic. We just need them to continue to score. And I think I saw enough from Spurs against Villa to make me think that Son is a fine hold for these fixtures because they still created chances, right? They accumulated over 2 XG, and I know Villa aren't great and they've got this high line away from home, but they aren't a terrible defence. And for Spurs to still create that number of chances, it looks promising because our worry was that in the absence of Maddison, Spurs just wouldn't create any chances. But I think they will, especially with the likes of Lascelles, so very creative player. And I think Son will get involved in the creation too, so we might start to see more assists from him as well. But I saw enough. All I wanted to see was, are Spurs still going to create chances? And it looks like they will. And I think that's due to the way that Postecoglou sets up. I do have his data here, Son, but it's a little bit useless for two reasons. One, this was when they had barely any injuries. Maddison was playing. So for that reason, like, we're not necessarily expecting him to replicate this exactly. And secondly, Son is that good of a finisher that you almost need to boost his stats by about 0.2 or 0.3 XGI. So it's only a 0.57 non-penalty expected goal involvement here, but he finishes everything. So I would boost that even higher. And again, this takes into account those first 3 games of the season when Son was playing out on the left wing. So data-wise, his data has been really good. We don't have a big enough sample size since Maddison has been out to assess that. But I think he will continue to get chances. Based on what we've seen, I don't expect Son to now not get a single chance. And it is worth noting that Son is on penalties. And so if, for example, Son had got the amount of penalties that Palmer has recently, and I know there's a lot of if, buts, and maybes, but let's just say that Son in the last 5 or 6 games got 2 or 3 penalties, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And I know you say, of course we would, because all of the same reasons apply, but I don't think you realise how much actual FPL returns and FPL points impact the way we think. And so I think if Son had got 2 or 3 penalties this season already, I think he would be in there for captaincy conversations every single week, and I think people would be thinking very differently about him. So he's a 90-minute man at the moment because he looks fit and he looks back and they have to play him. He's on penalties. The data I do think will continue to be okay, and I don't think the fixtures are awful. But to give you a counterpoint, because obviously I love him and I'm very biased and I think he's a great FPL option, the fixtures aren't great. So even though I don't mind them, they're not great. And there are plenty of players with better fixtures. He's 9.4 million, right? That's a big difference between the likes of Mbeumo, Gordon and Palmer. So you can save a lot and move it elsewhere, especially if you need to move back to Haaland. And on top of that, we don't really know yet. We've seen a couple of games, but we don't really know yet whether he will continue to perform in the absence of Maddison and obviously with some of the other injuries that Spurs have. So now is probably a good time to jump off him, right? He's got arguably the most difficult fixture in the league in Gameweek 14, followed by a couple more difficult ones before the blank in 18. Yes, it's an okay fixture in the blank, but you can navigate that and there are other players that you can own. So I almost feel like you jump off Son now and just hope that in the absence of Maddison, yes, he might occasionally return, but he won't haul, and he's not someone that will repeatedly damage your rank because he'll just tick along, maybe with the odd assist and goal here and there. Or I think you hold on to him and probably hold him through blank game week 18. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to maybe give him 1 or 2 more weeks and then look to move him off because the fixtures start to improve. It is worth noting, finally, after all of that Son will go off to the Asian Cup in game week 21. So around that time anyway, you're going to need to sell Son. So do you hold him for the next 6 or 7 game weeks? Or do you just move him on knowing that you need to sell him in the future anyway? I don't hate the idea of selling him. For all of the lovely things that I've said about him, for all of the bias that I have because I like him as an option, I don't think selling is a bad idea. For me, I'm going to give him at least a few more weeks, which probably means hold him up to game week 18 or 19. So I thought it was probably worth reassessing which players are at risk of suspension. So those players that are on 3 and 4 yellow cards. Just as a reminder, if maybe if you're new to FPL and football in the Premier League, a player that receives 5 yellow cards before their team has played 19 Premier League games will be suspended for 1 game. And then after that, it's at 10 yellow cards, which I think the cutoff is 32 Premier League games for their team. But basically, up until their team has played 19 games, which for most teams will be game week 19, then they are at risk of suspension. The ones on 3 yellow cards, I wouldn't really worry about at the moment because they need to get 2. So you've got at least 2 more game weeks with these players. But something to assess, especially when you think we've got blank game week 18 coming up, that would be a real shame if they got suspended in game week 17 and then obviously missed game week 18. But I think Onana, Taylor, Trent, Lascelles, Udogie and Palmer are the players that are on 3 yellow cards. Taylor, Lascelles and Palmer obviously being the popular ones there. This wouldn't put me off Palmer. It wouldn't even put me off Taylor and Lascelles. And for most of us, we've probably just got those cheaper defenders in our team. But something to assess, if any of them pick up yellows soon, then that puts them obviously right on the tightrope for suspension. The ones that I am more interested in is the players that are on 4 yellow cards, and the 2 that stand out are Matty Cash and Kieran Trippier. Lots of people will own both or one. Again, this doesn't mean that I think you have to go out and sell Cash and Trippier, but maybe if you're deciding between a couple of your defenders who to sell and it's a little bit tricky for you, this may impact your thinking. It may also make you just think that you need to sort out your defense. If you've got like 2 injured players plus one of these players that's on a suspension tightrope, that might make you rethink. So maybe not something you desperately need to do now, but something to keep an eye on. Some of the other defenders that are on 4 yellow cards, Luca Dean, Branthwaite, and 8 Nuri, who went off injured anyway. But these are 3 players that I don't think many people own. But again, something to consider, especially with blank game week 18 coming up. Douglas Luiz is also on 4 yellows. Some people still have him as a bit of bench fodder and maybe thinking about keeping him again for blank game week 18 because of the pretty easy fixture in that week. So something to assess. Hopefully for you guys, he gets suspended before then, or he just doesn't pick up that 5th yellow card. And then 2 other players that some people will own and maybe be looking to move towards is Sterling and Fernandes. Fernandes has had 4 yellows for a while now. I'm surprised he hasn't picked up a 5th because he's got a pretty poor temperament at points, but at the moment anyway, he doesn't seem to be picking up that 5th yellow. And Sterling is an interesting one. People deciding between Sterling and Palmer at the moment, maybe thinking about going a bit different. They're both close to a suspension, but Sterling is closer. So, to be honest, I don't think this is something that tends to impact my thinking too much. But maybe if I am choosing between 2 players, I don't tend to like bringing in the player that's on 4 yellow cards. But if for example, I've got a 50-50, then it may impact my thinking. But if I'm 60-40 in favour of the player on 4 yellows, I'll probably still make that move. But you do run the risk, of course, of missing them for a game. So this is just something to assess. We'll probably assess it over the next few weeks as well as some players start to rack up more yellow cards. But for the time being, something to just keep in the back of your mind. So the next discussion is around the Arsenal defence and whether they are essential or not. And if they are essential, is it 1? Is it 2? And who is the best pair, especially with a lot of people maybe already owning or wanting Saliba? Who's the second best to go there? Are they essential? Again, no one's ever essential in FPL, and you can definitely pick up points elsewhere. But, I mean, I don't currently own any Arsenal defenders, and it is a huge weakness of my team. And the reason for that, Arsenal have comfortably the best data in the Premier League this season for defence, for expected goals conceded. And that's both home and away. We've actually seen in the past, especially last season, Arsenal kept significantly more clean sheets away from home. But this season, it seems pretty equal when we're looking at the underlying data. So any given game, I think there's a very good chance for a clean sheet. And the reason for that, they're not as attacking, and they're doing what City do a lot of the time, which is just controlling games. And I think especially the addition of Declan Rice in midfield is massive there. And it's just the system that Arteta is setting up with just means that Arsenal concede very few chances. So are they essential? No. Are they comfortably the best defence in the league to invest in? Yes, because the fixtures are also there too. 16, 17, 18 is tough. So those 3 game weeks are pretty tough. I would say you either bring in an Arsenal defender now, in game week 14, maybe even in 15, or you then probably wait until game week 19 or 20, because whilst, again, they can keep a clean sheet against anyone, Villa away, Brighton at home, and Liverpool away look like 3 fixtures where I wouldn't expect a clean sheet, maybe a maximum of 1. So I think it's either you move now for Wolves at home and then Luton away, or you maybe suck it up, hope they don't keep too many clean sheets over the next 5, and then maybe look to bring them in post-blank game week 18, around game week 19. You could quite conceivably still move in 16, 17 or 18, but I just feel like those are 3 fixtures where there are other defenders that will probably score slightly higher than those Arsenal defenders. But let's say that you do want to bring 1 in this week, or maybe you're looking to double up, and I do genuinely think in an ideal world, if we had unlimited transfers or we were wildcarding, you would have a double up on the Arsenal defence at the moment. Who are the best 2 to own? Saliba is obviously the obvious one. He's the most nailed Arsenal defender. He's okay for goal threat. He's got a bit of bonus points potential as well. And he just ticks along very, very nicely. And you just know you can rely on him every single week. 5.5 million is still a very, very good price for such a nailed player in the best defence in the league. We normally pay that for a City defender, and they're nowhere near as nailed. So Saliba I still really like, and I still think he is the obvious one. And just because he's obvious doesn't make him a bad option. But bear in mind now, Ben White is only £0.2 million more at 5.7 mil. So if you have the money, you want to take a slight risk, go for it. He's obviously suffered recently with a slight sort of injury doubt, but I think longer term, Ben White is almost as nailed as Saliba, and he carries slightly more assist threat. I don't think Ben White's numbers are great, by the way. I think he was quite lucky to get some attacking returns earlier in the season, but he is an alternative option. But for me, Saliba is worth the savings, and he's just so nailed that I think I prefer Saliba to White. Gabriel, I think his rotation risk has been overplayed massively. I think he will miss 1 in every 10 games, and it could just be that the one that he misses is either a tricky fixture, which is less likely, or they just don't keep a clean sheet in that fixture. And even if they do keep a clean sheet in that fixture, you've got 9 others. So whilst Gabriel is not as nailed as Saliba, is he worth the sort of 0.7 pounds, 0.7 million pound saving that you're getting on Saliba? Then yeah, he probably is, to be honest, especially if you do think he'll play 9 of every 10. Now, if he starts to play 8 of every 10, then maybe Gabriel's not worth it. And then you're starting to think, do you know what, the points that you're missing out probably isn't worth the savings. But I think Gabriel is still a fine option. In my own team, I need to move back to Erling Haaland, and I am seriously considering just going for Gabriel, accepting the odd bench in, and hoping that he still gets close to Saliba, because historically, Gabriel has been better for goal threat than Saliba. And if that goes back to being the way, and Gabriel can get you the odd goal on top of Saliba, then it will probably even out anyway. So I still like Gabriel. I've got no issue with him. And if you need the saving, I really do like him. And Zinchenko, I still don't know how to feel about Zinchenko, because I think he's a bigger rotation risk than Saliba, Gabriel and White when everyone's fit. Zinchenko is definitely the biggest rotation risk, but I still feel like he is the preferred player in that back line, and he has what some of the other defenders don't, which is he has slightly more attacking threat than the other three, and on top of that, he's just a bonus points monster. He's just, like Trippier just picks up bonus points for fun. Zinchenko does as well when he plays. So if Zinchenko's fitness continues to build and he goes from being... Because at the moment, I would predict Zinchenko starts 7 of every 10. If he goes up to getting 8 or maybe 9 of every 10 and gets similar sort of with his level of nailedness to Gabriel, then all of a sudden, I think you're looking at a player that is probably worth bringing in. So if he can stay fit, if he can improve his fitness to the point where he is more nailed than I think he currently is, I like Zinchenko. But I'm especially looking at 14, 15, 16. Those 3 are all in the space of 1 week. Gabriel is a slight worry with those 3. Is he going to start all 3? Zinchenko, I would be extremely surprised if he starts all 3 of those games. So I feel like the Luton away game, we could see a benching for either Zinchenko or Gabriel. Whereas with Saliba, I just feel like he'll start all 3. So I like Zinchenko, I like Gabriel, but Saliba is still the one if you need to. And then for Raya, great. Not often that I would really like a goalkeeper transfer, but if you have the money to go from Areola or Turner to Raya, then why not? He's making saves. He's good for bonus points when he makes the saves. He is a good goalkeeper as well. And Arsenal are the best defence in the league. So there's very little to dislike about him. And on top of that, Areola stinks. So why would you not try and move to a goalkeeper? Often, actually, in a lot of our teams, Areola is a bigger issue than our defenders. So I actually think I would put Raya right up there as one of the best defensive options at Arsenal. So to put that together, Saliba's still the one to own, regardless of pricing. So I would say Saliba first, and then I would say it's probably a joint second between Raya and Gabriel for me, depending if you need a defender or a goalkeeper. Very closely followed by Zinchenko, but if Zinchenko is more nailed than I think, and I've got this one wrong, then I think it's a mistake, and I think Zinchenko would shoot right up into second place, because I just think he has that extra ability to haul on top of some of the other players. I'd love to know what you think of the Arsenal defence down below. But definitely, if you've got the transfers to make, I would look to bring in at least 1, probably 2 Arsenal defenders. So finally, I just wanted to discuss double Game Week 20, because we've been mentioning it for a while, but it's not actually yet been confirmed or announced, and it may well not be confirmed or announced. But Ben Crellin, the guy that predicts all of the blanks and doubles, has been doing it for seasons, and he's incredibly good. And also Planet FPL James, they've both still predicting a double Game Week 20. So I feel fairly confident that it will happen. And the reason for it is the blank Game Week 18 fixture needs to move somewhere, and the most obvious point is still Game Week 20, according to those two. So the reason that Ben thinks maybe it still hasn't been announced, you can read it down below here. That's not necessarily important, but he thinks if Game Week 20 is going to happen, which is still a possibility it doesn't, it's most likely to be announced next week, which will give travelling fans around 4 weeks' notice, which should be plenty. It is worth noting we have a Game Week 15 midweek deadline, and then obviously Game Week 16 at the weekend. So there's a chance it's not before Game Week 15 either, and it's actually only before Game Week 16. If that's the case, that makes it a little bit trickier, because then we only have like a couple of game weeks before the blank, and it may impact the way that you might have made transfers. So this isn't ideal, but Ben still believes that it's likely to happen. So I'm still going off the basis that it will be. It would obviously be a double of Sheffield United and Brentford for Manchester City. So Haaland triple captain is almost definitely going to happen in that week. I know it feels boring, but it's just so good not to do. Unless you think Haaland will be rested in one of them, I think you've just got to do it. So Haaland will be at like 250% effective ownership that week. And yes, I will definitely at that point have Haaland back in my team. So Don't fret yet. Double Game Week 20 could still happen. As soon as I get an update, I'll of course let you know. So guys, there we have it. That is my Game Week 14 preview. Hopefully you did enjoy today's video and you got some use out of it. And if you did, please absolutely obliterate that like button and gently tickle the subscribe button. I would really, really appreciate it. Until next time, which will be my team selection video. Thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.